Okay, we now move on to chapter 2, assigned for today, June 28th. And I'm going to give you two videos here on the methodologies of interpretation for Greek mythology. In this video, we're going to talk about what are called external methodologies. External means that the interpretation is that the person who has created the myth or is thinking about the myth is doing so because he is responding to something external to himself. So he may be responding to some phenomenon in nature that he's observed. He may be observing something that's happening in society that may be based on religion or based on a specific deity. There may be some phenomenon that needs explanation as to why it happened. These are external methodologies. And it's important to understand that many of these forms of myth interpretation have to do with the fact that in ancient Greece, science was just in its infancy. We do know that the Greeks made remarkably quick progress with science. You may have perhaps heard of Thales of Miletus, who was the famous astronomer who successfully predicted the correct date of a solar eclipse, the one that interrupted a big battle between Lydians and Medans. So the Greeks definitely knew about science, and they were making real strides toward explaining things in terms of scientific or naturalistic phenomenon as opposed to relying solely on the gods. All the same, though, there were many people who were not necessarily skilled in science and still felt that in order to be able to understand the world and maybe even try to control the world around them better, they needed to rely on religion and deities. So these are the external methodologies, and I'll run through them quickly here, and they may help you with answering the discussion questions for chapter 2. So the first one listed here is called nature. Nature means that the myth is a response to some specific phenomenon in nature as to why it occurs. The most obvious case is the one that you will read later, the hymn to Demeter and Persephone. You will read the story about how Demeter and Persephone, mother and daughter, were separated because Persephone was taken down into the underworld. It turned out that it was impossible for her to come back to her mother full time. As a result, a compromise had to be worked out that Persephone would spend half the year down in the underworld, which then became winter when her mother Demeter, the goddess of agriculture, was mourning and not allowing crops to grow. And then Persephone would come back up to the above world and would reunite with her mother, and then that would be spring and summer, the nicer weather, because that's when Demeter would be happy, and then fields and such would be prosperous. So that's one well-known example, but there are many others besides of explaining how nature is the way it is from a myth, explaining why certain gods did things the way they did, and that humans observe nature around them in that way. If a particular society observes a particular religious rite, that's called ritual. And to take that same myth of Demeter and Persephone, we'll observe how Demeter traveled to a district in the region called Attica, the one that surrounds Athens. When she did so, this district was called Eleusis. When she did so, she demanded that the city of Eleusis build a temple for her and initiate a new mystery cult on her behalf. And that was because Demeter was offended when she was invited as a nurse, because she was disguised as an old woman in mourning. She was invited as a nurse to take care of the son of the royal family, and at that time the son was an infant, so she was trying to put him in the fire every night in order to give him immortality, but someone saw what was happening and broke in screeching, "What are you doing?" So she got really upset because none of the humans properly recognized that she was in fact a god carrying out a divine rite. She was so offended by that she demanded this rite as payback, essentially, for having offended her this way. So that's an explanation for why in Eleusis and Athens there is this procession called the Eleusinian Mysteries that happens every year. So there's ritual. Charter is any kind of societal practice, like it could be a specific type of sacrifice, but it could also be any kind of society norm. So the story I told you in a previous video about Athena and Poseidon, the fact that women in Athens were not allowed to vote or participate in government because Poseidon had demanded that restriction as payback for his failure to gain Athens as his patron city. That's an example of charter, of explaining why a particular society does something in a particular way. And ideology, you might think of if you happen to be familiar with the Just So stories by Rudyard Kipling. One of my favorites in that one, which perhaps you remember, is called The Sing-Song of Old Man Kangaroo, explaining how a four-footed creature is running away from a dingo because he's, again, offended a god in that case. As he's running, he has to jump across a river. He cannot swim across, it's too deep. He also doesn't have any boat around, and so he ends up having to make a gigantic jump across the river like that. When he does so, he starts continuing to jump, and as he does so, the shape of his body changes, and he eventually ends up with very big hind legs that are made for jumping rather than running, and that's an explanation of how he ends up the shape he is. Another very famous story with the Greek side, it's actually told to us by the Roman author Ovid, and you're going to see it near the very end of this course, is about the mulberry tree. The mulberry tree has berries that turn from white to red to purple. And the explanation for that is that there was an unhappy event underneath a mulberry tree with two lovers who were supposed to meet, but one of them arrived too early and then was chased by a mountain lion. This lady, whose name was Thisbe, dropped her veil. The mountain lion, having chased after the woman, couldn't catch her, so she came back, and she chewed on the veil and made it bloody because she had actually just feasted on something else and her mouth was bloody. Then when the man showed up, the man found the bloody veil and thought Thisbe was dead. The man's name was Pyramus. He committed suicide. The woman came back, Thisbe. She found her lover dead under the tree. She committed suicide as well. You might notice that there's a parallel here to Romeo and Juliet in Shakespeare. When that happened, all the blood soaked into the ground, went into the roots of the tree, and soaked up the trunk, and eventually in through the branches, and finally into the berries. So the originally white berries were turned red, blood red, and that is why the mulberry tree has berries turning from white to red. So etiology is that type of explanation. So these are your external interpretations of interpreting myth. Again, nature, ritual, charter, etiology. Explaining things by the way that nature works, the way that religion is carried out, the way society carries out certain common practices, traditional practices, and an explanation for why particular phenomena occur the way they do. Next video coming up, the final one for today, June 28th, we'll talk about the internal methodologies of Greek interpretation. Come right back.